Welcome, friends, to Mr. Terrifying Nightmare. Story 1. I still remember the smell of pine trees mixed with the damp earth. It was the scent of something wild, untamed. That smell, it haunts me to this day. We were at a school camp, deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The teachers promised it would be fun, a chance to disconnect and bond with friends. But from the moment we arrived, something didn't feel right. It was late afternoon when we made camp by the edge of a dense forest, the trees towering above like silent sentinels. The sky was turning orange, but a chill in the air hinted that nightfall was fast approaching. As the others settled around the campfire, I wandered off alone, searching for a quiet spot to clear my head. My friends had all gathered to play cards, laughing and joking, but I didn't feel like joining them. I needed space. The woods were eerily silent, the kind of silence that presses on your chest. It felt as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting. I walked deeper, my footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of fallen leaves. I noticed how the trees seemed to lean inwards, as if watching me. Something, or someone, was out there. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, but I brushed it off as nerves. That's when I heard it. A whisper. It was faint, carried on the breeze, so soft I wasn't sure I had even heard it. Help me. I froze. The voice sounded wrong. It wasn't like a normal human voice. There was something hollow about it, something inhuman. I spun around, but the woods were empty, the shadows growing longer with the setting sun. I shrugged, thinking it was just my imagination. But as I turned to head back to camp, the whisper came again. Closer this time. Help me. My heart pounded as I scanned the trees. Nothing, no movement, no sign of anything at all. Yet the voice lingered, echoing in my mind. I started walking faster, my steps uneven as I began to feel the weight of unseen eyes on me. By the time I made it back to camp, the sky had turned dark. The fire flickered and crackled, its warm glow seeming fragile against the growing darkness of the woods. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was waiting for me out there. Later that night, as we huddled in our tents, the sounds of the forest grew louder, but it wasn't the usual night noises. There was a rhythmic scraping sound that came from deep in the trees. A slow, deliberate drag, like something heavy was being pulled across the forest floor. It grew closer. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the edge of the camp. We all jumped, hearts racing. I heard some of my friends whispering nervously. Our teacher went to check, but the sound had stopped before he could get far. He came back moments later, looking pale. False alarm, he said, though his voice didn't sound convincing. We tried to settle down again, but I couldn't sleep. The whispers had returned, only now they weren't just a distant echo. They were right outside our tent, surrounding us. I pressed my ear to the fabric, straining to hear. Let me out, a voice pleaded, soft yet desperate. I stumbled out of the tent, the cold night air biting at my skin. I didn't think, I just ran. Away from the tent, away from the whispers, away from whatever was pulling me towards the trees. My friends screamed for me to stop, but I couldn't hear them anymore. I ran until I couldn't breathe, until my legs gave out, and I collapsed onto the cold, wet ground. I lay there trembling, trying to calm myself, but the ground beneath me shifted. I felt a hand, cold and clammy. It was pulling at my ankle, dragging me. Panic surged through me. I kicked and screamed, trying to free myself, but it was like being trapped in quicksand. Something was pulling me, dragging me deeper into the earth, and that's when I saw it. A figure crouching low to the ground, its face obscured by shadow. It was watching me with hollow eyes, its mouth stretched into a grin that wasn't human. It whispered, just inches from my ear, "I've been waiting for you." With one final desperate tug, I broke free, scrambling to my feet and sprinting back towards camp. My lungs burned, my heart hammering in my chest. When I finally burst into the camp clearing, I collapsed in front of the fire, gasping for breath. The teacher and the others surrounded me, but they didn't see what I saw. They didn't hear the whispers. I couldn't explain it, but I knew I wasn't the only one who had felt it. I wasn't the only one who had heard the voice. The next morning, they found the remains of a campfire just beyond the tree line. It had burned down completely, but there was something odd about it. The ashes were smeared in a way that made no sense, like someone had dragged their fingers through it. And then there were the footprints, leading away into the woods. But they were wrong. They were too deep, like they were made by something far heavier than a person. We left that camp early, cutting our trip short. But no matter how many years passed, I can still remember it like yesterday. If anyone asks me about any unforgettable experience, I will immediately remember this. And sometimes I get weird dreams like those whispers in the dark calling me back. I don't know who or what they were, but until I became an adult, I was believing that. It's still out there. And someday, it will come for me again. And maybe it will come for you too. Now it sounds crazy, but I couldn't bring myself to go there even after years. Sometimes childhood trauma doesn't heal at all. Story 2. It was meant to be a peaceful morning, the kind where you can stretch your legs and get away from the noise of camp life. But that morning, I learned just how dangerous it can be to step out alone, and how quickly things can turn into a nightmare. I was 16 at the time, a quiet kid who didn't mind spending time on my own. The camp was in a secluded forest area, surrounded by dense trees and high hills. It was beautiful, but it also felt isolating. The other kids were loud, always in groups, but I liked the solitude, especially in the early mornings. So one morning, before anyone else was awake, I decided to go for a walk. Just a quick stroll along the wooded path to clear my head. I'd been at the camp for 3 days by then. The night before, we'd had a campfire, and the stories told around the flames about the woods, the strange noises, and the creatures lurking just out of sight were still fresh in my mind. But I didn't let it bother me. The woods were just trees and dirt. Nothing to fear. I slipped out of the cabin quietly, not wanting to wake anyone. The air was cool and crisp, and the sun was still low, casting long shadows through the trees. The silence was eerie, but in a peaceful way, like the world was still asleep. I walked along the narrow trail, my footsteps muffled by the soft earth beneath my boots. As I ventured deeper into the woods, the feeling of solitude was comforting at first. But then, something changed. It was a sound at first, something faint, almost like rustling. I stopped, listening. My heart skipped a beat when I realized it wasn't the usual sounds of the forest. It was footsteps. Not just one set, but several, moving quickly, too quickly. And they were coming toward me. I stood frozen for a moment, trying to pinpoint where they were coming from. My mind raced, thinking it was just a group of campers, or maybe some early risers out for a walk too. But something felt wrong. The footsteps were irregular, staggered, like they were trying to be quiet, but weren't doing a very good job of it. Then, out of nowhere, they emerged. 3 figures, all dressed in dark clothing, their faces hidden by the shadows. They were close now. Too close. Before I could react, one of them grabbed me by the shoulder, spinning me around with a force that made my stomach lurch. "What are you doing out here alone?" the first figure snarled, his voice cold and rough, like he hadn't spoken in days. I tried to step back, but the others were closing in. I could feel their eyes on me, hungry, predatory. Just a walk," I stammered, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't know if they were trying to scare me or something worse. One of them laughed, low and menacing. "You shouldn't have come out here alone. You should have stayed with the others." My breath caught in my throat. Something about the way they spoke, the way they moved, felt off. This wasn't some random group of campers. These people, they were different. They didn't belong. I tried to push past them, but one of the figures grabbed my arm, pulling me back with terrifying strength. "You don't get to leave," the second one said, his voice shaking with malice. His eyes, dark and hollow, bore into mine, and I could feel the fear creeping up my spine. I struggled, but their grip tightened. My heart raced, and for a moment, I thought I might not make it out of there. The woods were silent, the trees towering over us as if they were watching the whole thing unfold. My legs were trembling, my thoughts scattered. How had I let myself get into this? Just as I was about to scream, I heard it. A voice, distant at first, but growing louder. "Hey, what's going on?" The figures froze. I turned my head to see the camp director, Mr. Harris, running toward us, flashlight in hand. His face was a mask of anger, but there was something else in his eyes. Determination. He didn't hesitate. He charged at them, shouting, "Get away from him!" The figures hesitated, their eyes flicking to one another, unsure of what to do. For a split second, they seemed like they were going to fight back. But then, without warning, they turned and bolted into the woods. It was as if they knew they couldn't win. They didn't want to be seen. They disappeared into the shadows as quickly as they had come, leaving me breathless, my body still trembling with adrenaline. Mr. Harris reached me in seconds, his hand on my shoulder. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and steady, but I could hear the panic beneath it. I nodded, too shaken to speak. He led me back to the camp, his arm around me, guiding me through the darkness. As we walked, I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see the figures emerge from the woods again. But the forest remained silent, as if nothing had ever happened. When we returned to the camp, he immediately alerted the other staff. They searched the entire area, but they never found anything. No signs of the figures, no traces of anyone who shouldn't have been there. It was as if they had never existed at all. The rest of the camp went on as usual, but I could never forget the feeling of those eyes on me. Every time I went near the woods after that, I couldn't shake the sense that something was watching, waiting. And to this day, I don't know who those figures were, or why they were out there that morning. But I do know one thing for sure. I was lucky Mr. Harris showed up when he did. If he hadn't, I don't know what would have happened. The camp was never the same for me after that. I stayed close to the others for the rest of the trip, and I never went near the woods alone again. I learned that sometimes the darkest parts of the forest are where the real danger lies. And sometimes, even when you think you're alone, someone's always watching. Story 3. It was meant to be a fun, typical camp experience. The kind of trip every school kid looks forward to. Nature walks, team-building activities, and campfires where we'd tell ghost stories and roast marshmallows. But that night, it all went wrong. Horribly wrong. It started innocently enough. We were all 15 or 16, excited to be away from the rules of home. The teachers were there, of course, but they didn't keep too tight of an eye on us, giving us some space to bond and enjoy the camp. But like most things when you're a teenager, we decided to push the boundaries. It was the second night of camp when it happened. The camp was deep in the woods, surrounded by thick trees and a creek that ran through the valley. We'd already had a great time that day, hiking, playing games, and sitting around the campfire. But once the fire started dying down and the teachers began ushering us back to the cabins, that's when the idea hit. A few of us, me included, had smuggled in a bottle of alcohol we'd stolen from one of our older brothers. It wasn't much, just enough for a few shots each, nothing too crazy, or so we thought. We sneaked off to a secluded area near the edge of the woods, far enough from the cabins so no one would hear us. There were 6 of us, me, Mike, Chris, Ray, Sophie, and Jenny. 4 boys and 2 girls. We sat in a tight circle, the bottle passed around like a secret, each of us stealing a sip. The alcohol burned my throat, and we all laughed at how daring we were. The girls coughed like crazy, asking water. Thank God we had 1 bottle of water, which helped. It felt like we were getting away with something, like we were in control, out of reach of the adults and their rules. We felt like we are adults. But after a few shots, things started to feel off. At first it was subtle, a buzz, a warm feeling in my stomach. But then the world started to feel different, like everything was moving too slowly. The trees around us looked bigger. The air was thicker. The night sky above us felt like it was closing in, like the stars were moving, swirling. Chris was the first to start acting strange. He laughed too loud, his movements jerky and erratic. He kept pointing at things that weren't there, shadows, or so he said. "Did you see that? Over there. It's moving," he shouted, eyes wide, his pupils unnaturally dilated. We laughed at first, thinking he was just drunk, but then Sophie started to giggle uncontrollably, her face twisted in an expression I couldn't quite place. It was like she wasn't there anymore, like she was seeing something only she could see. "Sophie, are you okay?" I asked, feeling a sense of unease creeping in. She didn't answer. Instead, she pointed at the trees. "They're watching us," she whispered, her voice a low, raspy murmur. "They're always watching." That's when I began to feel it too. The weight of the air around me, like something was pressing down, suffocating me. The ground beneath me felt soft, too soft, like I wasn't standing on solid earth. I felt dizzy. My vision blurred and the trees started to warp, their branches twisting in unnatural ways, bending toward us as if they had a life of their own. I tried to steady myself, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. My thoughts were slipping, like I was sinking into a haze. Then Jenny screamed. "Get up! We're going back to camp," he commanded, his voice sharp, cutting through the fog that clouded our minds. He helped each of us to our feet, guiding us back to the camp. I could barely walk, my legs like jelly beneath me. I heard Chris mumbling something about shadows chasing us, and Sophie kept looking over her shoulder, like she was trying to escape something she couldn't see. It wasn't until we were back at the camp, safely inside the main building, that Mr. William explained what had happened. He didn't scold us, didn't get angry. Instead, he looked at us, his eyes filled with something else. Something that felt like pity. "I found you all just in time," he said. "You didn't just drink alcohol. You've been inhaling something far worse, a drug plant that grows near the creek. It's a hallucinogenic plant, and it's been known to cause exactly what you're experiencing right now. It's the reason you feel like the world's closing in, why your minds are slipping. That's why you're all hallucinating. There is a board to say no trespassing because of this reason, and we informed that going out towards north was off limits in the beginning of the trip. The drug plant had grown near the creek, and we had unknowingly inhaled its fumes while drinking. The alcohol mixed with the chemicals in the air, and it was enough to make us lose control of our senses. We were all high, stuck in our own distorted worlds, terrified and helpless. Mr. William took us to the camp nurse, who gave us something to settle our nerves, something to bring us back to reality. Slowly, the hallucinations faded, the world stopped spinning, and our thoughts started to clear. But even then, there was an unease that lingered, a feeling that we'd crossed a line, that we'd almost lost ourselves to something far darker than we could have ever imagined. The next morning, we were all embarrassed, ashamed of what had happened. We tried to act like nothing had changed, but I could see it in the eyes of everyone who had been with us that night. We had experienced something that no one else would ever understand, and it felt very shameful. And to this day, I still wonder, what if Mr. William hadn't shown up when he did? What if we had stayed out there longer, lost in the grip of whatever had taken over us? We were lucky to escape with our minds intact. But there's one thing I know for sure. That walk in the woods wasn't just about alcohol. It was about something much darker, something we were never meant to touch. And I'll never forget the terror of seeing the world bend and twist around me, and wondering if I'd ever come back from it. To this day, I have never touched alcohol or any drugs since that incident. I am almost 30 years now. The thrill of drinking lost its appeal, at least for me. Story 4. It was supposed to be a fun, memorable experience in high school. School camp, surrounded by nothing but the thick, whispering trees and the sound of crackling campfires. We were all excited to get away from the city, to experience something real and untamed. The smell of the damp forest, the eerie silence at night, the chill in the air as darkness settled over the camp. It all seemed magical. But that night, I learned the woods are never as empty as they seem. We were nearing the end of our 3-day trip. The camp was tucked deep in a forest, and the teachers asked us to go out and gather some firewood for the night. It was my turn, and I volunteered because I didn't mind. I was with a few friends, and the idea of being out in the woods with nothing but the moonlight felt thrilling. We grabbed our axes and headed down the narrow path, the trees forming a canopy above us, blocking out most of the stars. As we walked deeper, the forest grew quieter. The usual sounds of animals and insects seemed to fall away, leaving only the sound of our footsteps crunching on the underbrush. We were supposed to stay close, but after a while I found myself trailing behind. I noticed a large, twisted tree off the path, its bark darker than the others, gnarled roots like fingers reaching out of the earth. I didn't remember seeing it before. There was something unsettling about it, but I shrugged it off as just the shadows playing tricks on me. My friends were ahead, laughing and joking, when I heard a strange noise. It was faint at first, like a rustling, too heavy to be the wind. Then a soft thud, a heavy thud. I turned, half expecting to see one of my friends messing around, but there was no one behind me. "Hey guys," I called out, but my voice sounded strange, swallowed by the thickness of the forest. I walked a bit further off the path to investigate. That's when I saw it, a pile of logs stacked neatly beside the tree. The thing that stood out to me, though, was how freshly cut they were. But I hadn't heard an axe. There had been no saw. I should have left then, but curiosity got the best of me. As I approached the logs, I noticed something even stranger. The bark on the logs was smooth, almost unnaturally smooth. Not like any wood I had ever seen. It was as though someone had peeled it away, revealing something darker, something ancient beneath. I reached out to touch one of the logs, but the instant my fingers brushed it, the air around me seemed to shift. I felt a coldness seep into my bones, a bone-chilling cold that didn't belong in the middle of a warm summer night. That's when I heard the whisper. It was a voice low and guttural, like it was coming from deep within the earth. "Leave. Leave now." I spun around, heart racing, my breath caught in my throat. There was no one around me at all. Only the trees and the shadows that now seemed to grow darker, closer. My body screamed at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I stood frozen, rooted to the spot. Then the whisper came again, this time louder, more desperate. "Take the wood. Take it." I don't know why I listened, but I did. Without thinking, I grabbed the nearest log. The instant my hands closed around it, the ground beneath me groaned. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches stretching, twisting toward me like clawed hands reaching out from the dark. Suddenly, I heard my friends calling from up the path. "Hey, where are you, man?" Their voices were distant, but they pulled me back to reality. I looked down at the log in my hand, and for a split second, it looked different. Not like wood anymore, it was alive. A strange, slick sheen covered it, almost like it was breathing. I dropped it and bolted back to the path, my heart thumping in my chest, my breath ragged in my ears. The whispers followed me, barely audible but unmistakable. "You took it. You shouldn't have taken it." When I returned to camp, I was shaking, drenched in sweat. I didn't tell anyone what had happened. I couldn't. Who would believe me? But that night, as the fire crackled and the others told stories around it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching. And I wasn't the only one who felt it. My friends, who had never left the path, seemed uneasy too. We kept hearing the same low whispering sounds in the wind. Every crackle of the fire made us jump. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the twisted tree, its roots clawing up from the ground, pulling the earth apart. I felt the weight of those unseen eyes on me, pressing into my back like a hand on my shoulder. I stayed awake, staring into the fire, trying to ignore the growing pressure in my chest, trying to ignore the way the trees outside the camp seemed to shift with every gust of wind. The next morning, everything seemed normal again, as if nothing had happened. The sun was out, the birds were chirping, but something had changed. I could feel it in my bones. The woods had claimed something that night, and I knew it wasn't done with me. I don't know why I grabbed that log. I don't know why I listened. But I do know this. The forest doesn't forget, and it doesn't forgive. We left camp early. None of us spoke about what had happened, but we all felt it. I've never been back to those woods, and I never will. But every time I close my eyes at night, I hear it. Just beyond the edge of sleep. The whispering, calling from the dark. "Leave. Leave now." I wonder if I'll ever be able to outrun it. Story 5. It was supposed to be the highlight of our school camp, a day of hiking up a steep mountain that towered over the camp. Most of us had been talking about it for days, hyping it up as this epic adventure we would never forget. The teachers warned us about the risks, but we were teenagers, full of energy and invincibility. So when a few of us, including me, suggested climbing the steep part of the trail, everyone jumped at the chance. The idea seemed fun at first. The hike was already challenging, but the thought of pushing ourselves further to the very top made it feel like we were on the edge of something thrilling. The adrenaline was enough to make us forget about the danger. The group was excited, even though a few of the teachers seemed hesitant. But they let us go. After all, we were all capable kids, right? We started out as a group, taking it slow and steady at first. The steep climb was exhilarating, and it felt almost like a game. The rocks were rough under our hands and feet, the mountains stretching up before us like an untouched challenge. We took each step carefully, but every few minutes, someone would let out a laugh or a cheer, encouraging each other to keep going. I could feel the thrill building inside of me as we climbed higher, but I was also becoming more aware of just how risky this was. The rocks were loose, the path narrow, and one wrong step could send us tumbling down. But I pushed those thoughts away. I didn't want to be the one to ruin the fun. Besides, I wasn't going to let my friends down. As we neared a particularly steep section, we decided to take a break. That's when something unexpected happened. Kara, one of the girls in our group, was just a few steps above me. She was laughing and calling out to the others, saying how close we were to the top. Then, in a split second, I heard her gasp. She slipped. It was like everything around me went into slow motion. Kara's foot missed a ledge, and for a moment, I saw the panic on her face as she lost her balance. She began to slide down the mountain, her hands grasping at the air, her body tumbling helplessly toward the edge. My heart stopped. Without thinking, I lunged forward, my body moving before my brain could fully process what was happening. I grabbed her leg just in time, pulling with every ounce of strength I had. My hands locked around her ankle, and I yanked her back toward me, her body jerking violently as I fought to keep her from falling. For a moment, it felt like the world had frozen. The mountain, the wind, the other kids, everything blurred into the background. I couldn't hear anything but the thudding of my own heartbeat. The only thing that mattered in that moment was holding on. With one final pull, I managed to drag her up just enough to get her to safety. She collapsed on the rocky ledge beside me, gasping for breath, her face pale with shock. I didn't even know how I'd done it. It was like some primal instinct kicked in, and I just reacted. I didn't feel like a hero. I felt shaken, terrified even. I had saved her, but I could have lost her in an instant. We all could have. The rest of the group rushed over, their faces full of fear and concern. "Are you okay?" They asked Kara, but their eyes kept shifting to me. They were calling me a hero. "That was amazing," someone said. "You saved her." I didn't feel amazing, I felt sick. Kara was fine, luckily. She wasn't hurt, but I couldn't shake the images in my mind. Of her falling, of her body sliding away from me, of the horror of almost losing her. The adrenaline of the climb turned into a cold, gripping fear. What if I hadn't been quick enough? What if I had slipped too? What if the rest of the hike to the top was a blur? I couldn't fully enjoy the view or the triumph of making it up. All I could think about was how close we had come to disaster, how reckless we had been. When we got back to camp, everyone was still talking about it. I heard them calling me brave, saying I was their hero. But deep down, I didn't feel brave. I felt like I had made a terrible mistake. The whole thing had been too risky, too dangerous. What if something had gone wrong? What if Kara had fallen? What if it had been me? Even though everyone said I looked great in front of my crush Emily and how impressed they all were by what I had done, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had tempted fate. I had risked something that didn't need to be risked. The mountain wasn't just a challenge, it was a reminder that we weren't invincible. And no matter how much fun we had, there was always a price to pay when you ignored the warning signs. That night, I lay in my cabin, staring at the ceiling, haunted by the thought of what could have happened. I couldn't stop thinking about how quickly things had escalated. One wrong move, one slip, and we would have been facing a tragedy instead of a story. I never went near that steep part of the mountain again. It wasn't worth the risk. And every time I think back on that day, I can't help but shudder. I didn't want to be a hero. I didn't want to save anyone like that. The whole experience taught me one thing. Sometimes what seems like an adventure can turn into a nightmare in the blink of an eye, and no amount of adrenaline can make you forget that.
Follow Mr. Terrifying Nightmare Channel.